All right. Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Pruett. Today we are going to be talking about human trafficking. It's a bit of a heavy subject, but I wanted to get this out before the state fair gets to town because I want to emphasize how important it is to start to attempt to recognize these victims because they're all around us and they're hiding in plain sight. And I think the more that we talk about it, the more we'll start to recognize it and hopefully be able to help these people. So even though we hear about slavery being abolished years and years and years ago, there are more people in slavery today than any other time in history. Human trafficking is the third largest organized crime that's growing next to the international drug trade and the international arms trade. Massive amounts of money are flowing with this problem. If you look at the black market economy, drugs obviously makes the most money and all these are estimates obviously because a lot of this is unknown and not reported, but it's estimated that the drug trade brings in about $300 billion a year. You compare that to the illegal arms trade and the trade in people or in human trafficking, and both of those bring in an estimated $150 billion a year. Now, the thing that's causing human trafficking to grow is the fact that, say you have some drugs to sell or you have a weapon to sell. Once you sell that weapon, it's no longer yours and it's gone, and you've lost your means of income there. But if you have a human who belongs to you, for lack of a better term, you can sell them over and over and over again, and there's massive amounts of money to be had, and this is a fast-growing area of the black market economy. If you look at these profits, we can talk about billions of dollars, but at some point, all those zeros, I get lost. But if you can compare it to the other major companies in the world, human trafficking makes approximately $150 billion a year. That is more than ExxonMobil, Apple, Walmart, and several other major industries put together in terms of profits. Now, there's a lot of myths out there about human trafficking. One is that this only happens to immigrants or foreign nationals. That's not true. And it doesn't always have to involve physical restraint or bondage either. A lot of these is a very important psychological component that is incredibly tight and overwhelming for these victims. And it's not always only men who are doing the trafficking. So there's two different types of trafficking. One of the biggest parts of it is the sex trafficking industry. And you will hear these words are very important: force, fraud, or coercion of a person being induced to perform these acts, or if the person is not yet 18 years old. And we find that a lot of the victims of human trafficking, they get recruited into sex trafficking as early as 11 and 12 years old. But it's very important for police when they're trying to prosecute these criminals to be able to prove the force, fraud, and coercion of these individuals. A major area where this human trafficking is occurring is online. So it's all happening behind closed doors and in essentially the new back alleys of the internet. Young girls are being recruited by chat sessions or online, Facebook, other methods by these traffickers, and then they get posted online where men can find them. It's also happening at truck stops, strip clubs, and inside hotel rooms. Now, it's very important for us here in Albuquerque because I talked to one of the detectives with APD, and he said frequently where we'll see it the most is in hotel rooms and truck stops, and right where you would think they would be, typically Coors and I-40, some of the hotels out there, Carlisle and I-40, and then all up and down Central. But it's not always the seedy hotels that you would suspect. Sometimes there's very high-profile escort services online where some of the nicer hotels in town have also had this type of activity going on. Another place in town where this is fairly frequent is the Chinese massage parlors. Indicators that you would look for at these places would be a locked front door where you need to buzz to enter or come in the back. If there's girls that look like they're living there as well as working there. All of these are clues that this is a potential place where either sex trafficking or labor trafficking is occurring. Which moves us to the next segment of human trafficking is labor trafficking. Again, this is done through force, fraud, or coercion, but instead of sex trafficking in this instance, this is people who are being forced to perform different labor or types of service. Worldwide, if you look at just the forced labor victims, most of them come from Asia, but it's happening all over the world in very large numbers. There's many different types of labor trafficking. Typically, it's construction, agriculture, factories, kind of menial labor jobs, but it also happens in door-to-door sales and in the service industry. So open your eyes when you're out there looking at people who are performing these services and ask yourself if they're doing it of their own volition. When you look at statistics across the country, this is put together by a group called Polaris, which is actually a website I would highly recommend if you want to find out more information on these statistics and things to look for human trafficking. But they basically have a anonymous reporting line where people can call in tips and they collect data across the country. You can see that it's mostly located on the coasts, but there really is no area of the country that's not affected by this. If we look at New Mexico specifically, these are, again, from Polaris. This is data from 2017. 43 victims were identified in 2017, 25 traffickers, and you can see that the majority of this is around the Albuquerque area, but also some down by Las Cruces and up near Farmington as well. That I-25 corridor, they call it, after talking to the detective, they call this the circuit. Typically, girls will come into town for 3 or 4 weeks, and they will either be bused or driven by their pimp to Texas, Colorado, Arizona, Las Vegas, and California. And they typically don't spend more than about 4 or 6 weeks in any city. Keeps them a little bit disoriented, and it also keeps the cops basically away because they're not there long enough to raise any suspicions by police or neighbors or bystanders. There's much, much more than this. These are just the reported cases in New Mexico. One of the important things to think about when we're thinking about human trafficking is that anytime there's mass gathering events, so for instance, the Super Bowl, any major event with people coming from out of town, there's also going to be human trafficking victims coming in to serve that population. From the Super Bowl, I think in New Orleans in 2014, there's actually a news article about several girls being rescued from sex trafficking during the Super Bowl. Now that we've started to recognize these patterns of trafficking getting more prevalent during mass gathering events, the cops have figured out ways to intervene on that. Now, 2 of our biggest mass gathering events in this state where sex trafficking occurs would be the fair and the Gathering of Nations. I guess last year during the fair, there was a whole RV full of girls that moved into the old Caravan East parking lot right there by Station 5, where this trafficking was occurring right next to the fair. And the police knew about it. Unfortunately, there wasn't a lot they could do about it. We'll talk about that later, but it is very important to know that during these times of mass gatherings to have heightened awareness because this activity is really going to pick up in our area. So why do we care? Well, this is very important for us because 87% of these victims report that at some point they've come into contact with healthcare professionals. And so we are basically their first and maybe only line of defense to help get them out of this lifestyle. So it's important to start to recognize them. Now you ask yourself what kind of person would be a trafficker. Well, I can't answer that, but I can tell you how they act. They typically are very charming. They make a lot of promises and can be very manipulative. And they tell their victims, they might promise them more money, success, love is a big one, or employment, basically to get them into a better situation. They can act like a friend. They can act like a rescuer. Like I mentioned before, a lot of these people who are recruited into being victims of human trafficking, this happens when they're 10 or 12 years old. And a lot of it happens online through chat rooms. And these children don't have enough wisdom to discern when or if they're being lied to by older men. And if they're frustrated with their current living situation and someone is promising them a better life, it's very easy for them to run away and fall into this lifestyle. Now, of course, once they are into this lifestyle, they quickly realize that they've been abducted or kidnapped, but they are manipulated into the point where they can't leave. And a lot of times that involves drug use, drug dependence, and a lot of threats and intimidation by the trafficker. The most vulnerable populations are people who really are desperate for a better life. It's going to be children who are in foster homes, homeless children, adolescents, people who are already addicted and need some help, victims of domestic violence, refugees, anyone who is very vulnerable to believing promises of a better life or more money or true love. Teenagers are incredibly vulnerable to this lifestyle. The majority of trafficking victims, I think the average age is 14. Risk factors for these kids that get recruited into this, their higher risk will be children who are involved with welfare, children in an abusive household or with an addicted parent, any history of involvement with the juvenile justice system, or with underlying mental health problems. There's things that push victims into this lifestyle, and that would include any kind of poverty or hunger or lack of safe home environment, abusive relationships, or just need for belonging and love. And there's things that pull people into this lifestyle, and that would be maybe promises of glamour. You're going to get so rich, or we'll make you beautiful, or I'll love you so much for the rest of your life. All of those things can pull people into this lifestyle. Now, the traffickers control their victims 3 different ways. One is by force, and this can be beatings or confinement, starvation, or drug use. I've seen pictures and heard stories of these victims being locked in like dog houses or chicken cages, purposefully injecting drugs to make them dependent on their trafficker for more drugs once they're addicted. Fraud would be those lies about employment or education or success. And then coercion, a lot of times, especially this happens in other countries where there's a poverty-stricken area and the traffickers pull their victims out of this area and threaten to hurt their family, charge them fees that they can never repay, a whole lot of psychological abuse and manipulation, and then blackmail to call the police or immigration services to return them to the country that they came from. And it's hard to identify victims as well because their traffickers are very good at what they do. They see them simply as a commodity. They don't see them as other humans. They see them as a money-making machine. And so they tend to isolate them from any other individuals. They're constantly being monitored while in public, which is very important for us as we're interacting with these patients, maybe on a street corner or in a hotel room. Just realize that you're being watched. This is that trafficker's means of livelihood, and they're going to watch that like a hawk. These patients typically get very attached to their abuser. There's something called Stockholm Syndrome, where even though this person is being terrible to them, they still don't want to rat them out or run away. They feel attached to them somehow. A lot of times, because these people move around so much, every 4 to 6 weeks they're in a different city or a different state. They don't know the local resources. Many times they don't know the local language or the local culture, and they're just lost and disoriented constantly. And then there's this inherent mistrust of authorities as well. So it's really hard for these victims to self-identify because of all these barriers. Now, where are we most likely to interface with them? Typically, what we'll see is an assault complaint. If one of the traffickers is abusing one of his victims in public, which happens very frequently, maybe an innocent bystander will call in an assault and then we'll show up. It's important to have good situational awareness and realize what's going on around you and try to read the situation. Usually the trafficking victim will not be hit in the face. They tend to be beat in the extremities and the chest and the belly because the face helps with their product value, for lack of a better word. So the traffickers will tend to bruise them and hurt their extremities and their core a little bit more than their face. Sometimes with the labor workers, they can sustain workplace injuries that will result in a call to EMS. So try to get a good feel for the warehouses or the factories where you're going and assess the workplace injuries there. Frequently, the women will have pregnancy or gynecological complaints. Sometimes it's mental health issues, and a little bit more rarely it'll be intoxication or addiction problems where EMS might get involved. Important to note here is a lot of these calls for us are BLS calls. So this isn't just a paramedic problem. This is on everyone who is on scene to help try to recognize some of the indicators of human trafficking going on. Red flags that you might notice: huge amounts of cash, large amounts of gift cards, multiple different types of hotel keys or maybe multiple different types of cell phones. Other indicators that we have in our area, I mentioned that a lot of this is going on in hotels around town. If you're called to a hotel room where there's a girl in there, but you see a guy's clothing on the floor maybe, and she tells you that she's there by herself, that's probably her trafficker's clothing. A lot of times while the girl is working, the trafficker will be out in the parking lot waiting for her. So just basically this comes down to good situational awareness and having a high degree of suspicion. Frequently, girls will be branded. You can see that the traffickers like to put their names on the girls in places you would expect, on their neck, on their breasts, sometimes on their back. Crowns and money bags and dollar symbols tend to be pretty typical, as well as the trafficker's initials or name. Things that you should look for, we just talked about the branding or the tattoos. Your patient might be disoriented, not know what city or state that they're in. That's not because they're trying to be difficult. They honestly might not know. A lot of times that controlling trafficker is going to be very close by, pretty demanding, pretty outspoken, and not want you to touch his property. Frequently, the girls will avoid eye contact. This is a big cultural issue for victims of trafficking. Eye contact can suggest different things in that setting, and so a lot of times when they're confronted with someone they don't know, there will be no eye contact made. Just remember that these patients are pretty helpless and hopeless. They've been through unbelievable situations. They're terrified of their tracker. They feel like they have nowhere to turn. There's fear of law enforcement, that they're going to get in even more trouble, and frequently there's language or cultural barriers as well. So try to be compassionate towards these patients if you do identify them in the field, because they're under immense amounts of stress. Not only stress, but they're feeling shame and guilt. They're terrified, they're addicted, and they really don't know where to turn. So things that you can do for them when you encounter them in the field is just make them feel safe. Get them in the back of the ambulance, get them alone, be kind. Convey your concern and listen to them. Tell them that whatever they tell you is confidential. But make sure you don't make promises that you can't fulfill. You need to really understand the risk that they're taking by even talking to you. Do your best to ensure their privacy. Try to develop rapport with them. Really, you want to just let them know they're in a safe environment, and you want to offer them assistance if they're willing. You can't try to rescue them. The majority of them will tell you that they're adults, and you can't force them to get help if they don't want it. Red flags in their history to listen for is if it's scripted, or maybe the story they're telling you doesn't fit with their injury patterns. Usually that controlling individual will be very close by. If they're acting fearful or nervous or not making eye contact, if they're resisting your assistance, or they're unable to provide an address. A lot of times, say for instance you're called to an assault at the 7-Eleven, story doesn't match up, no eye contact, you see the tattoos, you've got the controlling person right around the corner. A lot of times these patients will try to refuse even going to the hospital. So it might be worth just trying to get them on their own, tell them you understand their situation and you want to help them if you can. Things that you can ask if you're not quite sure: where are you living now? Can you come and go as you please? Is anyone forcing you to do anything you don't want to do? Or is anyone threatening to hurt you or your family? Those might elicit some sort of response from the victim. Look for branding. Sometimes they're malnourished. Look for trauma and bruising patterns. Frequently, their contact with EMS will be for reproductive issues, unwanted pregnancies, genital trauma, vaginal bleeding, that kind of thing. And as you can imagine, a lot of mental health problems go in this situation too. So depression, suicidal thoughts, overdoses, PTSD, and other substance abuse disorders. Once they tell you yes, that they want help, let them know that you will help them. You can tell them that their safety is your priority, and get them to the hospital. That's the safest thing and the best thing you can do for them. Once you get there, you can notify law enforcement, notify hospital staff, and make sure you document very clearly what was said and what you saw. New Mexico actually has some laws in effect that protect these victims. They're eligible for goods and services. There's safe houses all around the city and the state, and federal benefits to them as well. Two of the agencies that local law enforcement partners with in order to help fight human trafficking are Lifelink and the Deliver Fund. Once the police have started their investigation and collecting evidence, the victims will be transferred to these agencies to help get them into a safe situation and get them the help that they need. There's also a New Mexico hotline you can call. It's 505-GET-FREE. And there's the national hotline through that Polaris project that you can call as well. And again, that website is worth looking at if you're interested in learning a little bit more about this issue. Ultimately, it's just important to realize that unless you know a little bit about this and start to know the indicators and what to look for, you're not going to see it, because this happens in the shadows, but it happens all around us, and it's important to try to be aware of it and try to help these victims. So if you have any questions, please let me know or talk to your 7-8. Thank you.